On the 27th of February, I took a plane to Nepal for a school trip as part of Dubai American Academy's Week Without Walls. I didn't know quite what to expect, but I was hoping to learn a lot about the country and the people. And believe me, I did. My classmates and I volunteered in the classroom of 7- and 8-year-olds in Pokhara, the second largest city in Nepal. I wrongly assumed the students wouldn't know basic arithmetic, but in reality, they were much more advanced. They were able to do their 5 times tables. You may think that's normal, but here in DAA, until I was a year older than they were. It was obvious that Nepal did not have the same resources or advantages that I have in a more developed country like the UAE, advantages that allow opportunity. We have so many more resources for our education, such as laptops, Wi-Fi, and smartboards, that we tend to take for granted, and we shouldn't. I use the term we because most of us here today, and those with access to TEDx, live in a more developed area. In a way, not having some of these technologies might actually benefit the students that I worked with because they're more motivated and driven to learn and grow. Having gone to Nepal, I witnessed firsthand the difference between what is considered a developing country and a developed country. According to the Cambridge Dictionary, a developing country is a country with little industrial and economic activity and where people generally have low income, while a developed country is highly industrialized and people generally have high incomes. I used to think that because people living in a developing country like Nepal don't have access to all of the amenities that we do, then they aren't as advanced as us. While it's true that the country may not be as technologically or economically advanced, there is far more potential and development here than I previously thought. I didn't quite realize that until I went to Nepal, but the perception that we have of the country does not take into consideration the power and strength of developing nations. So why aren't we more aware to realize the impact and contribution that people from such countries can make to the world? That's a problem that we face today. We tend to see developing nations in terms of what they don't have, and we blindfold ourselves to what else is happening. We think less of them. We need to learn to take off that blindfold and see the bigger picture. A stronger economy does not define a country's worth. Money doesn't make us better than others, nor does it actually make us happier, which we often assume. Here's an example. Costa Rica was rated the 12th happiest place in the world in 2013, despite economic struggles. So what else is going on, and why do we have this limited and filtered view of reality in these countries? The media might play a role. They focus on the worst of what is happening in developing nations. News stories are always focused on crime, poverty, deprivation, violence. How are we supposed to see these countries for something else if we focus on chaos and pain the majority of the time? Of course, it's not just developing nations that are victimized by flawed media, as it also happens to developed countries. But distorted media has a greater impact on developing nations. Our popular news channels reporting on international news are coming from developed countries, such as CNN from the US or BBC from the UK. Because of this, there is potential for biased reporting. I would like to share some examples and stories that show real achievements and progress from these developing countries. Rwanda. How many of you remember them for a civil war in the 1990s? In 1994, there was a genocide that killed around 900,000 Rwandans in a 100-day time period. Imagine 900,000 men, women, and children being killed by their own. Fast forward to 2014, Rwanda is ranked 7th in the world on the Global Gender Gap Index, demonstrating very high gender equality. That puts them ahead of countries like France, Canada, US, and the UK. Rwanda's president, Paul Kagame, came into power in 2000 and prioritized national development. Since 2013, they have improved in healthcare and education, and their economy is growing by 8% per year. In 2012, they won a Commonwealth Education Good Practice Award for their successful and innovative 9-year basic education program. Most people still think of Rwanda as what they used to be like in the 90s, corrupt and war-struck. The media focused on the genocide, but as soon as they started rebuilding the country, the world stopped talking about Rwanda. Even though they are now considered one of the most advanced African countries, they still have a negative reputation worldwide. Developing countries in general are achieving standards that we aren't aware of, and in some cases even outperforming developed nations in certain areas. Azerbaijan is a country with a high level of poverty, is ruled under a dictatorship, and lives under a restricted environment. However, in Azerbaijan, 99.8% of the people are literate. The world average for literacy is only 86.1%, so 99.8% is quite impressive. This high level of literacy compares to, for example, the UAE, where the literacy rate is 93.8%. A 6% difference may not seem like much, but that amounts to roughly 500,000 people more literate in Azerbaijan than in the UAE. While their education system may not be perfect, this high level of literacy shows how much their education is valued. And at the end of the day, that can lead to success in technology or economy. Now let's look at Mali and Angola. On the Innovation Efficiency Rating, which is a part of the Global Innovation Index, Mali was rated the #1 innovative country in terms of efficiency. And later, last year in 2015, the #1 country for innovation efficiency was Angola. This means that even though Mali and Angola are some of the poorest countries in the world, they are very efficient when it comes to innovation. According to the MIT Technology Review, the innovation efficiency ratio highlights countries that are best at making scientific advances and creating intellectual property despite disadvantages like unsophisticated markets and infrastructure. So you basically get more of a creative bang for your buck from these countries. Most people think that Mali and Angola aren't as advanced because they define success through economic terms. But that's doing these countries a great disservice. A country's economic status doesn't define how successful they are, yet that happens to be the way the world sees them. We think that just because a country has money or the newest technology, that they are rich and successful. It wouldn't be so difficult for the developing countries of the world to make a statement or impact if it weren't for the stereotypes that we have of them. One common stereotype is that all developing nations are oppressing and possibly more violent towards women. While this may be the case for some countries, it certainly doesn't represent all developing nations. Nicaragua is a country with a long-standing record of violence against women. Yet in 2013, they were ranked 10th in the world on the Global Gender Gap Index, later moving up to 6th place the following year. At the same time, the Philippines was the 5th most female-friendly country in terms of opportunity. In fact, in the last 30 years, the Philippines has had 2 female presidents out of 5, and together they held their position for 15 of those 30 years. Another stereotype people tend to hold is that all developing nations don't really focus on greener or earth-friendly initiatives. While this may be the case for some countries, it certainly doesn't represent all. According to the United Nations Environment Programme, Tunisia has implemented an energy saving system that has become part of the law in the country since 2005. They decided to be more proactive in reducing their oil and gas consumption and instead advocate the usage in renewable energy through solar energy. This is not only more efficient, but a huge innovative step towards environmental efforts. So it's not only the developed countries of the world that are making contributions to bettering the environment. If we didn't have pre-existing stereotypes, then all of the facts I've described wouldn't be so surprising. But they are, and that's because we do hold these stereotypes and labels towards developing countries. When we think of developing nations, the negative views is what we associate them with. Ignoring the bigger picture makes us blind to both the positive things and the tragic things that goes on there. We live in a world with so much connectivity and easy access to information. The least we can do is try to understand the whole of what goes on there. For instance, after last November's terrorist attack in Paris, online news articles and social media was flooded with support for the people in Paris. However, at the same time, there were similar related attacks in Beirut and Baghdad, which went largely unnoticed at first. People didn't give much recognition until others started to make a statement about it. This disparity in news coverage could also stem from what I mentioned earlier, the fact that our international news outlets are actually Western-based. Some people still use the terms first world and third world countries to describe developed and developing countries. This is degrading and perpetuates a negative view worldwide as if they are separated from the rest of the world. Opening our eyes to everything that goes on whether far or near to us, could bring so much equality to our world, and possibly a hope for peace and acceptance. We are blinded by the fact that developing countries have more to offer than we think they do. Maybe these countries are struggling in some ways, but in others, they're doing things that we could learn from. In a perfect world, these countries wouldn't have the labels and stereotypes that they have today. But we don't live in a perfect world, do we? We need to learn to look past these stereotypes and see the bigger picture. I abhor labels, and I don't think we should live in a world where they define us. However, I do know that there are possible ways we can change this. The media, for one, needs to stop targeting developing nations as only chaotic, troubled, and volatile. We also need to be more critical and aware towards what we come across and share on our Facebook or Twitter feed. I challenge all of you to look past these stereotypes and see the bigger picture. For me, it took a trip to Nepal. For others, it may very well be this talk. But no matter what, eventually, we have to take off that blindfold and open our eyes. Thank you.